Oh, he went for 11 weeks. He went from the Bean Blossom Festival. About a week after the Bean Blossom Festival, he quit talking to me and didn't start talking to me again until Labor Day up at Rosine. I mean, I'd go in a dressing room, and ask him for a note to tune to. He'd strike me an A note on that mandolin and walk off from it. Because that's how I used to tune to him. I'd tune to the harmonic at the 7th fret on my 4th string with that A and note the A on the 1st string, and that's, when I'd get in tune with that, I'd usually be in tune in G or B where the capos were or anything else. But that's how I tune. But that's all he'd do is give me the note and walk away. He wouldn't speak to me. Finally come on the bus up at Rosine, and he said, I want the Bluegrass Boys to go out and do 15, 20 minutes before they bring me on. And I was sitting at the table in the place where he played cards. I said, well, what do you want, 15 or 20? And he walked back up there in front of me and slammed his fist down on that desk, and he said, boy, I've been so mad at you for the last couple of months I couldn't even talk to you. And I said, well, that's kind of obvious. I said, you want to fester on it some more, or you want to get it out on the table right now? What's going on here? So he rattled on that I had said something about his activities around town for him doing, which I couldn't remember. And through this whole 15 to 20-minute tirade that was going down there, he kept accusing me of telling stuff that went on the bus that wasn't nobody else's business and everything else. And I kept telling him, I don't even think like that. I don't understand. Looked at me and said, well, you must have been all drunk up or all doped up one. I said, well, I might have been, but I don't even think in those terms. So it finally comes, I say, at this point, all I can do is if I said something that was out of line anywhere, apologize for it, assure you that I will be on my toes and it will never happen again. So he finally accepts the apology, as it were, and says, okay, we're just going on now, and we'll put this all behind us, and we'll go on from here, and we'll be friends. About a month, everything goes along all right, and we were coming back from Columbus, Ohio, caravanning with Jim and Jesse. They had been having some bus problems, and they wanted to, if their bus broke down, they wanted to be able to ride back to Nashville, leave their bus driver, to get their bus on in case it backed in, but they needed to get back to town. So we pulled in a little old truck stop restaurant over in Erlanger, Kentucky, and Jesse McReynolds sat down in front of Bill, and they started talking. And I was a couple of people away on one side or the other. We had tables pulled up together. And Jesse got to talking about how he and Jim, with some of their shenanigans that they used to pull, they was going to have to watch it because some of their band members were telling folks around town about what they'd been doing. Monroe pops out and says, yeah, we got one in our bunch like that too. So I just folded up my napkin, put it on my plate, and went out, paid my bill, and went out and sat down in the driver's seat. Monroe was the first one in the bus. I followed him up to his table. He grabs out his cards and starts dealing out his solitaire hand. And I just looked at him, and I said, I thought you said we was going to leave all that stuff in Rosine last month, that we wasn't going to be hanging on to none of it. Well, you didn't have no business saying what you did. I said, I've done tried to apologize to you. I said, we've been through this before. Well, about that time, Kenny and Wayne, and I think Randy was in the band then, they come on the bus, and they heard what was going on. They went to the back of the bus. Bill Aldridge starts the bus up, and here we go down this interstate. And in a good 10 minutes, we're going at each other tooth and nail. And finally, he looks across the table. He's got him a hand of solitaire laid out there. He looks across the table at me, pulls his glasses down over the end of his nose and looks right at me, and he said, that Lester Flatt was the worst guitar player I ever had. And I said, Monroe, what's Lester Flatt got to do with this? We're talking about this other thing. He said, well, we ain't getting nowhere with this other thing. I just thought I'd talk about guitar players for a little while. So that's the nature of what he was. He did so many wonderful things. It's like when anybody would ever come up to him and ask him who was his favorite guitar player or banjo player or fiddle player or anything like that. His stock answer was, they were all good when they worked for me. And that's one thing that I thought was just absolutely wonderful of him, is he never played favorites. And I worked there with Kenny Baker, and Kenny Baker got no concessions that anybody in the band didn't get. If you did your job as well as Kenny Baker did his, you didn't have to put up with a whole lot of garbage either. So, he was an interesting study. He was a very temperamental man. He was a very introverted person. and he was very temperamental, and he was emotionally driven at every juncture. So I don't know. And a lot of the turmoil that happened when I was there was just conflicts of personality more than it was any kind of a musical conflict. I came from another generation, another world than he did. And when I came back to work for him in 1977, you know, when I went to work for him in 1967, I was fresh out of high school and had never been anywhere to be out from under my father's thumb. My father had gone everywhere with me. So it was, you know, dropped me off at the Clarkston Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. That was a bit of an eye-opener. But when I came back in 77, I'd already been, you know, I went to school for a couple of years trying to dodge the draft. It didn't work. They got me anyhow. So I wound up going in the military in 1969, got out in 71. After I got out, within 6 months, I'd gone to Nashville. Within a year, I was doing A-team sessions. Taylor had got me in on some of them where I was working for people like Leon Russell and, you know, big-time sessions down there. Then I went to work for the Newgrass Revival after a deal there, and I'd been to Las Vegas working with the Harry James Phil Harris show out there. So when I went back to work for him in 77, I was a seasoned professional, and it was a professional of that day. I was a little bit on the wilder side in my younger days, and Monroe didn't care for that, and he made no bones about it. But, you know, I constantly told him, if you can find somebody that'll do the job for you that I'm doing for the amount of money that you're paying me, hire them, tell me about it, and I'll be gone the next day. But it never happened, you know. I had to force the whole issue to a head, and I wrote that in my book. I will not relive that for you tonight. That was one of the awfulest things I ever did in my life. And when it came time for me to make the Shine Hallelujah Shine record, we had made that first record for Hey Holler once again from the top. And it was my understanding from that thing that it sold something in its brief stay out there on the TV thing, that it sold something like 65,000 units out there for him. And he came back to me wanting a gospel album, and I refused to do it until I'd made my peace with Monroe. And I went to Ralph Stanley's festival down here. It's maybe 130, 140 miles from where I live. And Blake Williams held my hand all one afternoon until I could find a moment where there was nobody else around Bill. And when they finished up his show and the afternoon performances, everybody was going over to Carter's grave to have a little ceremony that they would do down there every year for him. And Bill was the only one left in the back of the stage. And Blake told me that was going to be my time, so I went up and stood in the doorway. So when Monroe came to the doorway, you know, he couldn't get past me. And he just looked up at me, and the first thing he said to me was, "What do you want?" And I looked back at him, and I said, "Mr. Monroe, the way I left you, it was the awfulest way that I've ever conducted myself in my life. I'm ashamed of it. I've come here to ask you forgiveness and to issue my apologies for the way all that happened." And he just looked at me and he said, "Well, it's about time." And after that, I accompanied him over to the little ceremony for Carter and everything. And from then until the end of his life, I would go down and spend time with him and just sit around and watch him play anytime that I could.